Hey everyone, thanks for joining again. Today is session 2 for the Monkey tool presented by Ken Puls, who is a amazing MVP, a rock solid developer as far as all this Excel stuff. It's an add-in that's for Excel. Monkey tools is quite amazing. I was here yesterday listening to Ken talk about it, and my mind was blown. I couldn't stop smiling the entire day. It was just super fun for me to listen to him talk about something he's so passionate about. So with that, I'll just kick it over to Ken. Let me get you going here, Ken. Let me get your desktop and your video going, and you're going to be up and running.
Should be going. All right. Can you see it, everything? Everything's good?
I got your desktop. We just pushed it. Okay, we're
live.
All
right, awesome. Good stuff. So, I'm not going to do the whole intro of me again today. I mean, we did that yesterday. So, what I am going to do though is just throw up this screen here. And yesterday we went through and we talked about the first half of the ribbon for Monkey Tools in Excel, which was all about working with our query monkeys and destination sleuth, query sleuth, and time sleuth. Today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move now into more of the data modeling side, where we're going to take a look at some features around pivot sleuth that'll help us diagnose what's going wrong inside our pivot tables. We'll take a look at our Dax sleuth as well as the model sleuth and some other features along the way here too. So I'm just going to flip over to Excel. We're going to dive straight into demos today and see how much we can cover in our day. Actually, I'm just going to go back and get my toolbars back. So I'm just going to escape out of that. There we go. Nice. And so here we are back inside an Excel file. And if you were here yesterday, the data will look probably a little bit similar to what was there before. It kind of looked like this. And I have a nice little model that I've set up on this one here. And I'll just open this guy up and take a look at the actual diagram that we have showing up, which looks like this. All right, so 4 tables linked together in the star schema. We can see that we've got categories linked on category. The same over here. On this side, we've got date linked to date and date linked to date over here. So the thing that I really want to sort of draw attention to in this case here is that this model, as far as the structure goes, is absolutely perfect. There's nothing wrong with it whatsoever. So the question really comes down to then, why, when we go and actually hit a pivot table like this, do we get this really frustrating, really stupid little yellow error message that says there's relationships needed between the tables? Because you already saw that there are relationships between all the tables. I cannot possibly create another physical relationship here. Now, we can always go with the auto detect, which comes back and says, we can't do anything here. So that's super helpful for solving that problem. You can manage them, but if you don't know what to do, well, I mean, honestly, even if you do, the relationships are set up correctly. So why am I getting this crazy yellow message? And we see this a lot inside forums as to what's actually going on. Why do we get this? So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to cook up this little feature here called Pivot Sleuth. And this is a feature that we wrote specifically to try and help debug this specific issue with pivot tables. And you can see that sometimes it decides to show up and then go behind my screen, which is something I'm trying to figure out how to fix. But regardless, we've got our nice little dialog. What I've done here is I've basically taken the field list that comes from a pivot table, and I've also added some extra pieces for slices and timelines. There's a few things around this that are important. You'll notice we've got a couple of different colored fields here. One of them is my budget, which is yellow. And there's a couple of pieces that I sort of want to show on this one here is that it's immediately telling us what the issue is. Of course, I moused over it, it went away. So I'm just going to click on it. It'll bring me up the text down the bottom here as well. It tells me what the caption of the field is. In this case, it's budget. It matches what the actual table is. So there's nothing that's changed here. But I give you the fully qualified source data name right here. So you always know where it's coming from, even if somebody's changed the name, because I find that's one of those things that's kind of hard to figure out otherwise. The second thing is it's telling me that this cannot be filtered by sales category. We can see the red field over here, and in this one, we give you a ton of data on this particular one here. Now, I'm not going to go and read the whole thing through this, but basically what it's telling us is that there's no relationship path between sales category and the budget column. And it also says, hey, sales category is actually a foreign key on a table, and we recommend that you switch it out for the primary key from your actual dimension table. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do exactly that. I'm going to take that advice. I'm going to come back to this and say, oh, okay, here's my sales category. I really should be using the categories from categories table. So I'm just going to uncheck this guy. You'll notice the yellow or the little yellow message goes away right away. And I'm going to go and put category under class. And at this point, my pivot table immediately comes back. Everything looks pretty good with this one. And if I go back and hit my pivot sleuth at this point, what you can now see is that everything comes up Nice and clear. There's no error messages or anything that's actually hiding behind the scenes as to what actually is going on with us. So that's kind of a nice little thing that that helps us out with the way that this should work in diagnosing those particular issues. There's additional advice inside this as far as a modeling recommended practice as well, which is to go back and actually take care of these things, because I don't want somebody using the category field from the sales table because it actually causes problems. I don't want them using date from my sales or my budget table. I want them to use the one from calendar. I also am not a big fan of implicit measures, which is where we go and drag amount into our pivot table. I would rather have explicit measures like sales, which is already the sum of amount. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into Manage Data Model, and I'm going to find all of the unaggregated fields on my sales table. I'm going to say hide from client tools. I'm going to go to my budget table. I'm going to do the same thing, hide from client tools, so that only my measures are actually visible on these tables. When I do that, there's going to be a couple of really interesting things that end up changing here. Number one, it is impossible to now go and grab the wrong field and put it onto your pivot table. So we're never going to see that yellow message because it's just not going to happen. You can't do it. The second part is that you'll notice now that all of my tables also get a different icon on them. It's no longer got this little table icon. This is actually representative of a dimension table. These are fact table icons. This icon is the same as what you see in the values area. And when you actually hide all of the unaggregated columns, those things get that icon, pop to the top of the table, so you now see my fact tables are listed in alphabetical order, and then my dimensions go in alphabetical order as well. So this actually makes it super, super easy to find things, and it's one of the reasons that I actually don't typically create a single measures table, because I now know that I can actually have these guys set up and categorized. They kind of act like folders for where I actually store my measures. So that's kind of a nice little tip here. But the big thing is, at this point, when I hit my pivot sleuth, these are going to come up clean because I couldn't use the wrong field on a table. So that's a good thing there. Now I'm going to get rid of this guy, and I'm going to go into a different one, show you a different view with some slightly different data here. So this one, we're going to go in and we're going to take a look at this one called measure table. Now, in this model, I've actually gone through and I've got similar data. It's slightly different. The model structure is going to look close to the same, but with one small difference. If you were here yesterday, you saw that I can actually use Monkey Tools to inject a measure table into my model with just a couple of clicks. So this has got a separate table that's disconnected called measures. It's sitting over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back now and I'm going to take a look at my first pivot table. And you can see that this pivot table, if you actually were to go back and take a look at the data, it actually looks like it's calculating perfectly fine. All the numbers look right for sales, for budgets, the variances are right, they're calculating possibly or perfectly. So why do I get this relationships between tables may be needed error? What the heck is this all about? And the interesting part about this is that the pivot table itself is actually built perfectly fine. The relationships are right, the measures are right, they're all coming from the right tables, everything is good here. So why do I get this crazy yellow message? And why can't, I mean, here's the other thing, why isn't there a button to just make it go away permanently? But you can make it go away permanently if you actually treat the data correctly. So what do we find out? If I go to Pivot Sleuth, you'll notice that we actually have, let me bring that back again. In this case here, we've got a whole bunch of yellow and red going on in this case. If I look at sales, it has a lot more information going around it. It says, look, measures is actually a disconnected table. Your measures are going to calculate correctly, but this is always going to cause this measure to, or this message to actually show up. If it's intended to be a measure table, flag it as such by hiding all the unaggregated columns. Right now, it tells you that it doesn't think that these two fields can filter this particular item. So I'm giving you all the context behind why is this causing a particular issue. We've got the same message for budgets, the same message for variance. And if I go and take a look at something like class, for example, it actually says, look, this field has no relationship and can't filter these particular guys over here. And it actually tells me for each one of these things. So based on the advice that we see from this one, it says, why don't you hide all the unaggregated columns? So if I come back into Manage Data Model, right-click on Measures, hide from Client Tools. When I go back to Excel, boom, the message goes away. And that's all it actually takes, is to make sure that your measures table has no unaggregated columns, and at that point it will actually suppress the relationships maybe need a message for you automatically. So that's a helpful thing to know around this thing, and it's not something that's super discoverable. There's not really a lot of stuff that actually leads you to believe that you should actually be hiding columns in your model. Let's go take a look at another one. So here's another table, and on this one, there is no relationships maybe needed error message. But when you actually go and take a look at the actual data itself, there's some things that look highly suspicious, like the fact that my sales for 2018 and 2019 appear to be the same number. My budget is showing up as the same amount for every single one of these rows in every single area, whether there's sales or not. So there's definitely some things that look like they're going a little bit sideways. So if we go back and we take a look at Pivot Sleuth right now, it comes back and it says, hey, you know what? There's still potentially some problems on this pivot table. So the first one is budget year, and it says budget is a fact table. You shouldn't be using fields from fact tables in dimensional areas. So the more you learn about dimensional modeling, the more this makes sense. And this is one comment that I actually did get back from a buddy of mine who's an MVP when I actually went and hit this with a tool here. He said, I don't know enough about dimensional modeling to make sense of these messages, Ken. I said, well, to me, the biggest thing is that you actually need to learn about dimensional modeling, because that's going to help you not make those particular issues. We can't just, give you knowledge, but I'm trying to do as much as I can here. So there is some terminology around this that will need to make sense to you. But the big issue here is that we don't actually want this here, because we can't cross-filter other tables. So what we're going to try and do here is we're going to go and say, well, is there another field that we could use? So let's see, budget year on the budgets table. We don't want to do that. Calendar has a year, so let's take calendar off of the budget table and put calendar here on columns. And what we can see now is that our sales, at least, the values are actually different. So it's now got those broken down properly. So that's the first stage of fixing this one up. The second one we're going to look at, if we go back, is the sales category. And sales category says, hang on a second, this is a foreign key. It might work, but unfortunately, it doesn't always. And what we recommend is that you actually switch it out for the primary key instead, which is categories category. We'll also suggest that you hide this so that you prevent a user from using it. Again, you should avoid using fields from your fact tables in your dimensional areas, because they could cause problems. So let's go and take a look at this. Here's sales category. This is my dimensional, or this is my fact table, even though it's not flagged as such. I'm going to go and uncheck category here. We'll put category onto this pivot, and now boom, everything looks absolutely beautiful. Still no error messages. There never has been one here. And there never has been one because the measures table has actually suppressed them by actually having this set up correctly. But now, if we go back to our Pivot Sleuth, everything's nice and clean, it's working properly. This is how the table is supposed to look. Again, the big piece of advice on this is, if I go back to my model, date is a foreign key. The primary key is over here, and we always have the primary key is on the one side of the relationship, the foreign key is on the star side. Category is also a foreign key. On the budget table here, date is a foreign key, category is a foreign key. Year, quite frankly, shouldn't be here because it's actually picked up by date over here. So to clean this up, I'm going to go through and say, let's hide these from client tools. We'll get rid of those ones. We'll grab these three guys here, hide those from client tools as well, because I want those picked up from the proper dimensional tables. And then I also want to think about amount. Sales is sum of sales amount, and the budget is sum of budgets amount. So why don't we grab amount over here, hide from client tools, and right click and hide from client tools. Now I realize that I've actually hidden the entire budget table here. I didn't really mean to do that, but honestly, at the end of the day, by hiding all the columns, it's going to actually hide those off from my table anyway. So I just don't really see anything that's going on in this particular case at all. So at this point now, somebody can't use the wrong fields and can't get into an error that is either visible or not, which is the way that we actually want to set things up.
This is a really interesting concept. I mean, you do the same thing. This is a much more visible way of seeing these challenges with the Pivot Sleuth, because in Power BI Desktop, you don't really necessarily get those problems, or you don't get warnings at all for that matter. But then if I ever design a Power BI model such that an Excel user could use it, these are all very common practices that you just want to do when you build a model.
And it's interesting because that's one of the things that I'm actually not sure I'm a fan of in Power BI. I'm still trying to figure out how I feel about that, right? You can draw up these fields on it because no indication that anything has gone wrong. You've got to actually really look at the numbers to see, is it doing what it's supposed to do? And I mean, I'm an accountant, right? I mean, what does an accountant do when they somebody doesn't get information? They add one more column of more numbers to really, mystify everybody, right? But it becomes really hard to actually see what's going on. So in some ways, that relationships maybe needed area is actually helpful. But the problem is that it's only helpful when you really understand what's going on. And when you've got 30 tables in your list and there's fields from everywhere, it's really hard to figure out what's going on. So but there's theory behind it. It's just that you have to know the theory, and if you've never learned it, it's really challenging. So that's what this is really trying to do, is to try and go through and actually help with that. So
very cool.
I'm going to show another model. I'm going to show you a really complex one now. This one gets pretty gross, and it's not going to look great by the time we're done because honestly, the whole thing should really be redesigned. I actually built a sample of this one specifically to go and show some of these issues. So I try to double click on that. Let's see if we can actually get this to open up now. And here we go. So this is going to be a big gross pivot table. There's a lot of stuff that's going on. It's going to have a relationships maybe needed error that's going on in this particular one. And what I want to do is I want to show you what this looks like in the context of something that's actually rather large. So if I go and say show queries and connections here, sorry, not queries and connections. We don't need to see that one. I'll get rid of that one. I need to go back to Pivot Sleuth. Use my own tools, Ken. Come on. So in this case, what we see here is that we're actually also picking up all of the slicers that are impacting this pivot table, as well as all of the timelines that are impacting this pivot table as well, even if they are on different worksheets. And that's kind of an important thing to recognize. Chit details sales down here, you'll notice when I mouse over it tells me the caption is actual dollars. That's what we see down here because somebody's pulled chit details sales onto the pivot table and they've renamed it. Well, that's a real hard thing to try and figure out later because in actual fact, what you can see is that it actually renames it in the field list as well, which means how do I know which measure that is if I'm going back to try and actually modify my measures? So working that backwards is tough. So in this case now I can actually figure out very quickly what this really is. And it says, hey, you know what? I can't filter you based on business lines. That's not going to work. I'm going to come back to that one, though, because I just want to sort of tear this one down. We'll notice that chit headers hour here is a foreign key. We recommend that you replace it with shifts hour because that's the primary key in the relationship. Chit details item ID is also a foreign key, so we're recommending that you switch that one out as well. So that's the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to collapse down some of my tables over here because I've got a lot of noise in this. But you'll notice we got item ID over here for chit details. And if I show all of my pivot table fields, there we go. Here is items. So let's pull item ID off of here and we'll put item ID from this one on. And as I say, this is forming a really gross pivot table. I did have to do this for a reason at one point in time, but it didn't make me proud. So anyway, I'm going to pull hour off of this one here. And
it's amazing.
Well, it's true though, right? I mean, sometimes you got to build really gross stuff because you have to, but
sometimes it gets the job done. It doesn't always have to be spot on.
You don't have to like it, right? Don't have to like it,
but it needs to get the job done. That's true.
At any rate, so at this point here, if I go back and I actually pull up the Pivot Sleuth now, actually I need to close it and refresh it here. So let me pull this guy back up, and now we can see that we've got rid of the blue one. So we're happy with that. We're now using primary keys instead of foreign keys, so they're coming from the dimension tables, not the fact tables. That's good. But what we see here is chit details still can't be filtered by business lines. I go, okay, cool. So let's go and get rid of business lines, because honestly, business lines is in a filter. Can you even see it? No, because it's actually under the slicer anyway. So it really isn't adding any value in this case. So I'm going to take business line and we'll pull it off the pivot table. And at this point, my relationships maybe needed error goes away. Fantastic. I'm happy with that. If I take a look at Pivot Sleuth, it comes back and says everything's nice and clean. Fantastic. But now I want to go and I want to add budgets for whatever reason. And bear with me because this is going to get nasty. But if we go and put budgets on, we're going to get a really gross looking pivot table, and we get our relationships between tables maybe needed error again. Now, I don't budget to the level of an individual department for an individual transaction, which is why it's showing like this, but I'm really just trying to prove a point with the fact that when I come back in, I now get additional context as to what's actually happening in this case. Shifts hour is giving me a problem. It says I can't filter budgets. The reason being, well, I don't budget to the level of the hour for my individual shifts. item ID also has no relationship path and can't filter it because I don't budget to the level of actual item. And I certainly don't budget to the level of chit ID. Chit for a record or just for reference is kind of like your transaction ID in food and beverage. So what if, though, I've written a DAX measure for budgets and this is right and this is what I need it to look like? Maybe that's the case. How do I actually fix that? Now we can absolutely do this. This will work and it will make sense, or we can make it clean up this message and make it go away. So if I go into Manage Data Model, all I actually need to do is come back to my budgets table and say, look, these unaggregated column here for amounts, I'm going to hide that from Client Tools, and I'm going to turn this into a proper fact table. If I go back and hide all of my unaggregated columns on chit details as well, and turn this into a proper fact table too. When I now go back to Excel, it's going to go and it's going to recalculate the model, and it will now come back, and the relationships between tables error is going to go away. It disappears because I'm actually using items from two individual tables that have been marked as fact tables. And this is actually completely consistent with between both Pivot Sleuth and what's actually going on inside the Excel window as well. And the reason we do this is because Excel doesn't understand from its relationships may be needed errors. It doesn't understand virtual relationships, things like use relationships, things like cross filter, treat as. I'll be honest right now, my tool doesn't either. It's something that we've actually got to work on and fix here. But if you ever do want to actually go and see what are the potential things that are causing your cross-filtering issue, all you need to do is unhide one of those columns on the budget table to actually work backwards in order to actually get this to work out. So as a matter of best practice, we highly recommend that you keep your measures on measures, either on measures table or you hide all the unaggregated columns to suppress those error messages where you need them. But in the previous example, you also show that even if you actually misconfigure things with different fields, it can actually it can show other issues that are happening on the pivot table. So the whole idea behind this is trying to give people a nice and easy way to understand exactly what's going on inside these things and why you're getting those crazy error messages, give you a little bit of a leg up in those particular areas. All right, so that's a few different looks through Pivot Sleuth. This is typically one of the first things that I'll do if somebody gives me a file and says, I've got a relationships maybe needed error. I'll just hit it with that and take a look because that really lets me get into it nice and quick. What I'm going to move to now is I'm going to move to the next feature on my ribbon, which is the Dax Sleuth. So when I go and pop open Dax Sleuth, it actually gives me a view that looks like this. So it's similar to the Query Sleuth that I showed yesterday. It is actually a Dax Dependency Tree that I can actually look through and see what's going on. And you'll notice that we have a little legend down here. We've got some different colors. So Implicit Measures, sum of units right here, has a Dax formula. If I go and click on it, it's sum of chit details units. This will actually show up inside this particular list in orange because somebody dragged a field into the pivot table. So the thing about these is even when somebody drags it off the pivot table, it looks like it goes away, but it remains in your model as hidden. Now, it doesn't really matter, but personally, if I'm going to release something to a client, I actually want to clean all that kind of stuff up because I want it to look like I've done everything properly. When we look at the yellow measures, these are all explicit measures that have actually been written that have no child objects or no relationships to other DAX measures whatsoever. Blue ones are calculated columns, like EOM calc here is using a formula inside one of my tables in order to actually generate that. And the green ones here are all measures that have children. What does that actually mean? I'm just going to hide the legend down here, and I'm going to go and take a look at some of these guys, like burgers sold all time here. So burgers sold all time has calculate, it's got burgers sold. Burgers sold is another measure. And I can actually see that by clicking on the little plus to expand it, that this is actually a child measure here, which also happens to have a child measure, which I can actually go and take a look, which is sales units. So I can now step down and say, here's burgers sold all time. This is burgers sold that's being used within it, and it's actually calling sales units, which looks like this. So I can now go and take a look through that entire measure chain and see how does this thing actually built up, or how do I tear it down. If I go and look at something like growth, let me see, where's my growth versus 2009, I can also double click on it and it will expand the entire hierarchy tree out as well so that I can see the individual components that are actually making this guy up. Now, some interesting pieces to play around with this. If I go and look at burgers sold all time, this is where it gets kind of fun. I actually want to be able to look at this in a little bit more complete context. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on flatten. And what flatten does is it actually says, go get me burgers sold and replace burgers sold with what the burger sold pattern actually is. Also nested in a calculate to make sure that the context transition actually affects properly when we actually look at it. So my burgers sold all time, if I flatten burger sales out, actually comes out to look like this. And then I can say, well, yeah, but there's still sales units in here. What does that mean? So I can flatten it down further, and it actually looks like this. So we're actually doing an indenter as well with the stuff that we have here. What's interesting about this is that it allows you to actually really start seeing what's happening. And I didn't actually have this tool built a few years ago when I was doing a job for helping somebody with their model. And this guy was building a crazy model, which was an activity-based costing model, which if you've ever done accounting is really, really hard. And when I went through, I had to manually do this and took one of his measures apart because his model, it was taking him 40 hours to rebuild the file. It was really unstable in Excel. It was crashing all the time. And yeah, it was nuts. So finally, after a couple of go-rounds of this, and I went and flattened out one of these measures, and I worked out that the measure pattern, if you flattened it out like this, was 17 pages long of nested measures that were in there. It was doing things like if-then statements. It was doing switch statements. And basically the reason it was so long is because his data was absolutely in a crappy format, and he was trying to use Dax to do all of his data cleanup. And I went, you know, this is crazy. I said, why don't we go back and like rebuild all the data structure in Power Query so we can make the Dax easy? He said, yeah, that's good, that's good. And he phoned me up about a week later. He says, I rebuilt the model again. And I'm going, oh no, because we've been through this a couple of times. I said, how long did it take? He says, it took me about 8 hours. And I went, wow, you went from 40 to 8? What happened? He says, man, you were so right. He says, my data was in terrible shape. He says, I cleaned everything up with Power Query. I landed to beautiful tables. And now let me show you my longest measure. And his longest measure was 3 lines long. And I went, okay, now that's useful, right? I love that. Get me wrong, but I'm no Marco Russo. I can't parse 17 pages of Dax in my head. That doesn't work for me. So in this case, what this allows me to do is very quickly see how complex is this stuff? How big is the chain? In addition, maybe you look at this and go, well, this is cool, Ken, but I really want to know where is sales units actually used? Well, so flip it into the dependence view. And now we get a list of all these. Here's sales. Sales happens to go into these guys here. Where do sales units go? Well, sales units actually gets used a lot more. This is a model more about how many we've sold than what we've actually, you know, dollar-wise. So we can actually see all these guys. So we can flip it back and forth between dependency and precedent views.
What? Okay, this is another really good point. Ken, you're literally every 10 minutes, I'm getting like boom, 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 another good point, this is another complication I have in Power BI. I use a bunch of stuff. I never know where it's used. There's no tracing in any of this.
Yeah. So, well, speaking of tracing, you know what? How about this? What if I were to do something like this, Mike? What if I were to go to sales and say, which pivot tables is this used in, or which chart is this used? Like, so do I want to actually see, for example, if I click on the chart, hey, look, there's the chart that's being used, or there's the pivot table that's being used, or here's the OLAP formula that's actually got this in there as well. Now, I don't have this built for Power BI yet, but I will show you that I can actually use Dax Sleuth against the Power BI model a little bit later on. So that's kind of neat. Now,
dude, I'm intrigued now. This is amazing. I'm loving this.
So here's another cool thing. I've got a burger sold measure. I'm happy with it. I like the formatting. I like the formula. But what I want to do, actually, let's use this one, draft sold. That's pretty darn close. I want to make a new measure for canned beer. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and click duplicate, and I'm going to call this one canned beer. And there we go. So what this is going to do is it's now going to go and write this into the Excel model with a new measure called canned beer, and then we'll see it sort of reflect on the left-hand side here once the calculations are all done. And at that point, then I can actually go and make a modification to the actual pattern itself. So just about done. Here we go. Here's my new canned beer measure, which still says draft. So I'm just going to go and change this now to canned beer. And now I'm going to click update. So this is now going to write the new formula back into the actual Power Pivot model as well. I got asked for this by a buddy of mine that was actually testing this kind of stuff as well. He said, look, this is one of the things that I do all the time. I have to duplicate these, and right now in Excel, I got to go into Manage Measures. I got to drill into the measure. I got to grab the pattern. I got to go back out. I got to make my new measure. I got to paste it. I got to make all my format changes. He said it'd be way easier if you could just do that. I said, okay, cool. So we did.
So here's a button for you to fix your whole problem.
Yeah, well, there you go. So now I have a canned beer measure, and I can go and throw this on, and there we go. It's done, and it's got the same format as my draft sold over here, and it's nice and easy. So
that's cool.
Yeah, it's kind of a neat little thing here. And I mean, there's a few different options for grouping by tables or showing things a little bit differently inside there as well. So Now, I'll show you a little bit later on what I can do with Power BI in that regard as well. But before I do that, I'm actually going to switch into another gear here, and we're going to move away from Pivot Sleuth and the Dax Sleuth. I'm going to actually start moving into the Model Sleuth. I will say that I have plans to do a lot more around the Dax area. Typically, what I've been focused on more originally is in the Power Query side, because that's really one of my big passion areas. But we are looking at things, as I said yesterday, like a kind of a quick measure kind of components and things like that, to sort of play around and do a little more in this to make it easier to take that next step once your data is ready. And I'm a big proponent of, try and make your data models nice and clean and get the model structure right to make your DAX easy. But once the DAX is easy, I still think DAX could be easier than what we actually have right now. Why should you need to write the formulas for this? You really shouldn't. So we're gonna solve that later. But for right now, let me move into this. So let's talk about the next components that we got here. What's in this model? You don't know because you haven't seen it before. So I'm going to go and run a quick model summary on this thing here, and I'm going to kick out a report of what makes up this model. So inside this model, we got 9 tables, 9 relationships, 20 measures. It takes almost 11 megabytes of data space to actually store this. 9 of my queries that I use for Power Queries are loaded to the model, 7 to connections only, and 16 queries in total. One thing to be clear, this total does not always match the sum of the things above, because you can load to both the data model and a worksheet as well at the same time. I can see in this file that every single one of the data sources that my Power Pivot model is using all come from Power Query. If I were to find something like this direct to an external source or direct to linked tables, today I would probably be trying to modify those, because I prefer to have everything go through Power Query, using the ultimate in shaping flexibility, as well as being able to make it more portable when somebody changes their database back from Access to SQL Server or something else. We give you a list of all the relationships in the file with their primary key tables and columns, foreign key tables and columns. I tell you whether or not they're active or inactive. In Excel, the cardinality will be many to one for every one of these things, but of course, Power BI supports more relationship cardinalities, so this might lead you to where I can maybe take this as well. I've got some nice summary stats for my tables. Are they fact or dimension tables? We go through and actually work out that based on how the relationships are set up. You'll also notice that business lines, which we saw earlier, is disconnected. So that might be something that I want to look at as to why is that, especially if I'm picking up somebody else's model. I can also see that shifts here is snowflaked. Now, that's kind of an interesting one, because from a purely optimal point of view of your model, if we go back and we take a look at this for a sec, inside the diagram view, we can actually see that my shifts table is hanging off the side here. It's got a one-to-many relationship. There is no reason in this model that I couldn't take this, instead of having a separate table for this, and move shift name and shift sort back into the chit headers table and actually make this a little bit narrower and drop a table. So that's a hallmark that I'll actually look for. We tell you how many rows are on it, which are the biggest tables, how many columns they have, and where the data source is. Underneath that, we go into more detail with the actual table stats, giving you the column names, the data types. These can be important. You're better to have whole numbers than decimal numbers in the Power BI model. You're much better to have numbers than text. They compress better. We tell you how many unique values are, because that's what Vertipack uses for actually dealing with its compression. Are the columns hidden? Are they not? Are they data columns, or is it a calculated column? And if so, what is the actual formulas being used? So I can very quickly go through this and take a look and say, are there any things that actually concern me around this kind of stuff? Like chit ID, for example. This is a numeric field. Why am I storing it as text? I'll bet you if I converted this to whole number, that with 174,000 records, the data footprint on this would go way down. So that's something that I would actually look for if I'm trying to optimize my model. Here's all the measures that I'm using inside this model, and this stuff gets to be fun, because we actually give you all the Dax formulas as well. Now, I don't have these indented, but one of my friends actually said, Ken, could you put this in a table here? So if I turn on the filter buttons, you can see this is actually an Excel table. And the reason he wanted that is because he's got the Dax formatter, I think, from Marco Russo or SQL BI. So he's got that installed in Excel. So he can actually now highlight this and just convert it and use their indenter on top of my tool, which is fine. I mean, one day we'll probably add an indenting option to this, but in the meantime, use SQL BIs. Why not? We tell you what's explicit, what's implicit. Check this out. There's an implicit measure right here. It's not used, but it's still in my model. And this is something that I like to clean up. So if I go back to manage my data model and data view, this is actually interesting, because I got a friend of mine that came back and he said, look, Ken, he says, I'm looking, I don't know why it does this, but here we go. Here's my measures. He was looking inside his table, and he said, you say that there's a measure on this table, but I don't actually see it. Where's my implicit measure? Now you can see mine's hiding right over here. The reality is that in the default state, this is how everything looks. Your implicit measures are hidden, but they're still here. So if I want to get rid of it, I need to show them and then delete them to get rid of them and clean it up. And now nobody knows that I ever dragged a field into a pivot table, which is what I, obviously tell people not to do. So that actually allows me to clean those things up on the back end. And if I now go and rerun this report, this second sum of units, if I go and run the model summary, should no longer be there. So
I've seen a number of tools, and I actually have a couple of these tools hosted on the Power BI Tips website that is trying to get to this level. I mean, a lot of them do really good things, but man, boy, is this really functionally efficient and makes it really easy to get
like
to
I say,
all
Mike,
the pieces of the model.
Like we said yesterday, right? Like it's not enough to dump out a list of what's there. Like it's trying to be able to get into a format that you can interpret, and that's one of the pieces that I feel I can bring stuff to the table. Is I don't care about data. What I care about is information, and I'm trying to figure out how to get that. So here's a list of all the queries, by the way, that are in this model.
I'm checking. You can't see me, but I'm grinning from ear to ear right now.
I actually can see you. I've got you on my other screen. I can see your grin. So, so inside here, I'm actually going to the precedent types because these are all the queries that I'm using. And if I uncheck query and blanks, these are the data sources that are driving my model. So now I know where my data is actually coming from. And I want to do a little bit more work around this because I do funky things with using parameters and whatnot. And I'd like to drill those back a little bit more. But regardless, at this point, I now know that I've got a data source from Access, one from a current workbook, and one from a SharePoint folder. At least I understand where I'm actually hunting. Now, the question is, though, is there any impact? Can I clean anything up in this model? So there's a couple of things that I want to sort of go and take a look at here. The first one is I'm going to run this unused items report. So if I run this, it now comes back and says, look, you have a whole bunch of natural columns in your model that are not being used. You could safely delete these, and it's going to save you some space in your data model. None of these are calculated columns, but we do look for those. We don't have any measures that aren't being used in this particular workbook, so there's nothing we can save there, and there's no queries that are not being used in this one either. But these guys, these columns here do take space. So how much space do they take? Well, you know what? Let's go and take a look. We're going to run a memory usage report. So right there is the memory usage that's actually being used for this particular model. Everything from the chit details table is actually in use right now. What's interesting in this model, if I were trying to optimize it, is my chit ID is text. This is a field that could absolutely be numeric. So if I change this to a numeric field, I'll bet you that this would drop significantly. I mean, we look at how much space it takes to store these numbers. I could probably actually go back and save a huge amount of space inside this model. And when I look at chit headers, which is also a really big one, what's the big key? It's chit ID again. So if I compress it from this table, it's also probably going to save me space here because I'd have to set it to a number on both sides. That's going to make a big difference to the actual data footprint. When we look at calendar, we've got a couple of interesting things around this. All of these guys are being used. These are the memory footprints of the columns that are not being used, which means that if I went back and deleted those and cleaned it up, I'm going to end up with less space in my model. Now, that's the actual footprint of what's there. There is a potential that it can actually change the footprint depending on how the compression algorithm works once you've actually reset your tables. But regardless, this has actually been a really useful tool for me because, again, I can actually connect to a Power BI model and extract this information out. I actually did this for one client, and we cut 80% of his memory out of his workbook simply by turning off the setting to auto-generate calendars.
Yes.
It created a massive amount of stuff that he didn't even know was there because I think he had something like 16 columns. He only had one table. He had 16 different date columns in there, and it made 16 different calendars behind the scenes where it was insane. So, one simple change, and boom, it made his model way more efficient right off the bat from a memory usage point, which was nice. So it's kind of cool things. There's a lot of tools that are sort of tying in together on this one altogether.
And I know from there's definitely thresholds, and I can speak from the Power BI side, especially when we're talking about optimizing and making the storage of your model as efficient as possible is very important, especially when you start getting into larger models. If you start sharing big models on an Azure Azure SKUs or the Pro SKUs or premium SKUs, there are limits to the size of your database sizes that you have. And so it's very important that you just kind of trim it down, only put out the bare minimum that you need. You can always add more later, but start with something less and kind of work your way up to a bigger or larger model. There's not a lot of great tooling until now, right? And I'm super thrilled about this, that lets me see all the details down to where can I start cleaning and trimming and getting rid of stuff that I don't need. This is amazing.
Yeah. So I'm going to show you now what I've done is I've actually stepped into a rather large model, and this one here is actually one that's pretty near and dear to my heart, because this is the one that paid for me to be a consultant for the first 4, 5, 6 months of my consulting career when I stepped away from my own job. So just to give you an idea as to what this guy is actually doing here, we were actually doing a financial forecast for this housing development that looks like this, and there was 25 sectors that were being built over 25 years with 8 different product types. And when they came to me, they said, look, Ken, we're having a problem here. We've worked with our town planners. We've done a whole bunch of work on this thing here, and the town planners have promised a whole bunch of stuff. But what we don't actually know is we don't know if we've actually overpromised. Are we going to make any money? And my job was to actually go and forecast all the costs and figure out what were they going to make or not. This is a massive workbook. There's a lot of stuff that goes in, and it's all done in Excel. And I'm going to show you right now sort of the philosophy of how we built this up. So every one of these green things here is a worksheet that is actually used for data entry. This is specifically, when we look at roadworks and intersection costs, I got the worksheets from the engineers, and we put it in the sense that made sense for the engineers to enter their data. When we did some other ones around DCCs, this came from a completely different person. So we built a sheet that made sense so that they would actually be able to input their data, making as few errors as possible. Land use stats was something that I wrote, so that one went more with mine. Revenue timing was gross and ugly, but all of these got pulled in, manipulated through Power Query, fed into Power Pivot until we fed them out into reports inside our workbooks. There is no way I could ever do this job in Power BI because there are simply too many inputs that need to change. Now, what happened then? I drew this by hand. This is the map of the Power Queries that are actually being used to feed this model. We start with the purple ones, which are worksheets. These nice little parallelograms here are all the named ranges and tables, and every blue box you see is an actual query. All of the little circles here are on-page connectors to other places where the actual queries get reused. So you can see this one here feeds out to stage 11, which feeds into this one. The green ones are also Power Queries, but they're ones that load into the Power Pivot data model, which then go out to worksheets. Like, this was insane.
I can't tell if I'm impressed or I'm scared.
You know what?
I have mixed feelings about this diagram.
Well, I mean, let me tell you. I mean,
it's amazingly huge.
It was huge. I mean, and it took a long time to refresh. And you can see how many queries are there, right? And when we go back and we take a look at this, I mean, I'm sure this would give BI architects a nightmare. But you know what? At the end of the day, here's the thing. This is the query stack. Wow. And you look at it and you go, Ken, that's insane. Well, why would anybody do this? I'll tell you why.
It's a data warehouse.
Because we needed it. I mean, that was the thing. They had no database. Yeah. They were a company that was working to build forward. They didn't have an IT infrastructure on what was going on. They had spreadsheets. This was a master plan that we were working on. And then it came down because I had one other problem, and that's that my client he was a bit of a scope changer, right? He'd change his mind on something. Yes. And then you go, oh my God, how is this going to work? Because I need to change something that's going to happen here, and what's it going to affect? Yes. And this is a bowl of spaghetti. You can't zoom in, you can't zoom out. You can zoom in or you can zoom out, but you can't move things around.
It's not intelligible though. It doesn't let you see, you can't click the relationship and follow. It's so hard to see.
Where does this one go? Yeah, you can't see it. No. This didn't actually even exist when I built this. This is how old it is, right? Yeah. So this was actually a really big inspiration for what I showed yesterday with Query Sleuth. Yeah. I actually built Query Sleuth to try and understand this model. So if I go back and say, look, let's hide the legend here, and we take a look, I mean, this was the part where I could now go through and start looking at the individual components. I didn't actually show this yesterday either, but this is actually kind of cool because if I decided that I wanted to actually change something in this, maybe the category wasn't supposed to be overhead costs or I spelt it wrong and it was supposed to be this, I can actually click the update button and just like this, boom, it's written back to Excel already. What? Now, this is awesome because I don't have to wait for any previews to refresh. Now, I should probably do this because otherwise it's going to blow up. But yeah, I can change things all the way along the way on that, which is pretty awesome. But here's something that's cool, right? So if I go and double click on calendar, there's the chain for that one. This was the problem one. This is one.
Holy moly.
Yeah, it's a nightmare. It's a monster, this one here. And then you look at it and you go, okay, but how is that going to help you? Well, I now know there's a bunch of stuff that's feeding into it. The bigger issue is when he came back and said, I'm going to change something, and you go, okay, what was it? It was this one here. So if I double click on this, where does it go? Wow, it goes to a lot of places. Now I know what I actually have to walk through. So that was one of the reasons why I built this. And I still feel that what we have here is actually superior to what they ended up building inside that. It's not as visible or visual, but
yes.
But it is nice to be able to track back and forward. And if I see something, I can actually look at it and see exactly what I'm looking for, and it can even make changes live, which is kind of nice.
The tree is very helpful. I like the tree because while visual is good, the tree is very compact and very dense with information.
Exactly, and that's the idea of what I was looking for in that particular place. I mean, Destination Sleuth shows me where all of these tables end up actually going. So you can see that we've got some queries loading to tables, some to data model, some to connection only. This is one of the reasons why we actually put checkboxes, so I can see just the stuff that actually loads out to different places and whatnot. We had our, I won't show you the time sleuth, but I'll show you the results of it. The Dax Sleuth on this one, you can see that, again, we've got lots of stuff. I've got a few different implicit measures. Why I have the sum of project here, I got no idea. That makes no sense. So that's something that should have been cleaned up before I sent it to the client. But I didn't know it was there because I moved it off the pivot table when I accidentally put it on, right, and didn't know. So looking at things like amount, you can see the individual components. It's used in a lot of places. And then again, with this, we can actually jump through all of the different places to go and see where are these guys actually being used all the way down to the level of OLAP formulas, which is pretty awesome. I'll show you one more component down the very, very end of this. Wrong place. There we go. All the way to query timing. I mentioned that I had one model that I actually built that for. It was this one. This model inspired so much. Which query do you think I would spend my time on trying to optimize in this case? It's got to be forecast, right? I mean, this one.
It's the one at the top.
Exactly. I mean, but how do you know that, right? So I mean, I set this and I walked away and I let it go and run and see what actually happens. And I had to do it with privacy off because otherwise it just took way too long. So, but I mean, this is the kind of stuff where it actually really becomes super useful. If I want to document it, this will take a little bit longer to run because there's more stuff to chunk through and whatnot. But the key thing here is that I can still go back now and get a real quick summary as to what actually is happening inside this model and know what should I be looking at. Like this, there's a direct table linked directly into PowerPivot that's not going through Power Query. Wait, that doesn't meet with my unusually high standards and expectations. I want to go back and figure out what's going on. And guess what? It's this one. I can see it because it says worksheet table right here. So I now know what I'm looking for, and it's a disconnected table. Okay, well, that's kind of interesting. And when I start scrolling down here, it's this one called QTR1. I've got a bunch of these guys here. Nothing's hidden. It's data columns. Okay, cool. And as I keep on going down and playing around with this, I can actually see that there are some measures, this one here that lives on this, an explicit measure that's not used. And I go, really? So why do I have this? Well, now I can run a report on my unused items. And this fascinated me when I did it the first time because I found out that I had 2 queries that I wasn't even using. I'm like, wait, what? Like, that was a query masterpiece. How can they not be in use? And yet, when I scroll down, these 2 queries here, which were important, did not actually get used in the model. So I could get rid of those and clean that up because, let's face it, there's enough there. There's a bunch of different explicit measures and implicit measures that aren't used, some natural columns, calculated columns that aren't used. I now have a hit list of what to go through and clean out of my model. And then, again, the memory usage, I can actually run that one back and boom, there we go. The memory usage in this case actually looks slightly too efficient for my like. One of the things to be aware of on when you're running these reports is that when PowerPivot saves on disk, it compresses its data when you close when you open the file. So when you open it, it's in what I would call a resting state. When you refresh the model, it actually opens up to what is a usable state, and that footprint's going to be much bigger. So you always want to do a refresh before you go and time it, just to make or to run this, so you know what you're really working with is working memory, because that's a big issue when you're working with Power BI for sure in the service. It's not about resting memory; it's about working memory is a big thing.
And that's because they're columnar storing the data, and what you're seeing here on this table is the column stores of that highly compressed information, and only when you actually use the table does it take it out of memory and uncompress it so it can be a full table. Is that kind of what you're saying?
I believe that's the case. Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
I can't remember exact workings on it, but
Yeah.
I mean, but you know what? Again, I mean, you
Makes
know,
sense,
running through this whole thing though, I mean, this was one of the big pieces. I mean, my most unique values are all in gross amount. They're decimal numbers, so you know, it could be real, right? I mean, I would have to go back and test that one out to see it a little bit more. But all right, now let me go through and in our last -5 minutes. I'm going to start from a blank workbook here, and I'm going to show you one more cool little thing here. I'm going to go connect to a Power BI desktop file and show you what I can do with this. So I'm going to drill down and pick up my demos here. I'm going to go with this LP Azure. So this is coming from an Azure SQL database, although it's stored in a Power BI desktop file on my system. So I do have to crack open Power BI Desktop, and we encourage you to be using you know, the most current version you can get your hands on this. But we will talk to Power BI Desktop file, whether or not you've installed Power BI Desktop from direct download, whether you've installed it from the store, or whether you've installed it from the Power BI report server. We can work with all of those. Nice. What we do is we actually crack open Power BI Desktop, launch it in that, so it'll launch in your default launcher. And at that point, we'll tell you that our data model has been loaded even before it's finished loading inside Power BI. Now, we're still in a blank workbook. There's nothing super special looking here, except that this is the LP Azure SQL model. I'm in dependence view, so let me change to precedence view. And we can see that these are the M queries that I am using to actually build up my Power BI model here. So these are the exact...
Hold on a second. I'm going to use this, and I'm just making sure it's clear. All you did was leave your Excel open and then open a Power BI file?
Well, I need an Excel open so that I can actually cook it with Monkey Tool. So basically, once I'm in here, I go connect to Power BI. I browse to the desktop, to the PBIX file, or I don't work with PBIT, but there's no data in those anyway. But I browse to the PBIX file. It launches Power BI Desktop for me, and then it'll come back with that message. Now, unfortunately, it usually launches Power BI Desktop in front of me. I wish I could actually make it launch behind, but regardless, once you see the Power BI Desktop frame, if you come back to Excel, you can click on the little message to say that it's there. At that point, you hit Query Sleuth. We're looking at LP Azure. So this is the format that I'm using to go and actually connect to my database. It's there. That's the URL for it. This is a sample, by the way. You can use it if you know the username and password. But at this point, this is all the steps that I'm using. So this is exactly what's going on now. One thing I can't do, I can't make changes and update Power BI, which is a real bummer. I wish I could, but that's a piece that's still a blocking issue. Microsoft hasn't given us a way to do that. I spent a couple hours again looking at it yesterday. Still can't quite get through. I'm
not
super
there yet.
close. No, but we'll get there. Once they give us the route, we're in. Dax Sleuth. Here you go. This is, again, the LP Azure model. And here's my sales, and here's my burgers sold. And here's my draft sold. What you don't see here is canned beer. Now, check this out. If I go back over to Power BI Desktop, though, here's the metrics table. So let me just open that up. So here is my burger sold. Here's my draft sold. So what I'm going to do on this one, if I jump back to Excel here for a second, I'm going to take my draft sold and I'm going to duplicate it. And I'm going to call this one canned beer. It goes much faster at Power BI Desktop. So there's my beer has been written, so canned beer is here. Although, unfortunately, it's still showing draft beer because I didn't update that yet. So I'll come back over here and say, hey, let's go take this. We'll make this one canned beer and updates. And if I jump back over here now, what we should see is, boom, there it is. So I can write Dax measures back to the Power BI Desktop file. So
yes,
yes, so it's a start, right? So
we're getting there.
We want to get to queries. That's important. So the other issue that we have, so you can still see all of your precedents and dependents. You can see all of that kind of stuff will work in here. You can see calculated columns that are going on, you know, all those kind of pieces. One thing, this is actually a bug that we got to fix here. This pane, which actually shows the dependencies in Excel, we don't have done for Power BI yet. This is one of the things that we do need to go back and parse all of your visuals and all that kind of jazz. We haven't actually, I know where the piece is that I got to do. It's just something that we've got to work on. But I think, Mike, is one of the things you're saying is, I mean, that'd be super useful to be able to actually look at it and go, where are these things actually in use?
Totally. Yeah, and I can point you to some other tools that I have on the website that do this, but only in Power BI. So this would be immensely helpful to be able to get all the way down to where this stuff is tracing to in a visual layer. So I can say this stuff just isn't used on these visuals. It'd be excellent.
Absolutely. And I mean, you know, at that point, once we have that information, it would also be super useful to be able to hit the unused items report. But we only do this for Excel models right now because I don't want to give you a false sense of security, have you delete a bunch of columns and then find out that your visuals relied on them. That would be really bad. I mean, so
that would be a bad day.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't do that. But what we can do, though, is we can still run our model summary. So in this case here, you can see this is why we actually track the many-to-one cardinalities, because there's obviously different cardinalities in Power BI. You shouldn't ever see any direct stuff in this kind of stuff going on, but we gave you your model memory. We tell you, you know, do you have factor dimension tables? Are they disconnected? Snowflake? How many rows, columns? What's the data source? You know, so you get a ton of information out of this still. All your measure stats are there. There's all the queries. So again, even in this, if I want to go back and say, okay, so what's happening inside LP Azure? Where does my data actually come from? Again, we drop off query and blanks. Everything comes from one SQL database, which is kind of nice, right? So I can see all that stuff. I can also go and run the memory usage against my Power BI model. So I've got that. Now, the status on these ones, because again, I don't know whether or not, I haven't parsed visuals and whatnot, I can't tell you whether it's in use or not, but at least I can sort of give you some ideas as to what's actually going on in this. So you look at it and go, well, I don't think I ever use POS chit number, or maybe I need to change this from text to a value. I can see that and rerun those. If you ever want to update it because you've made changes inside Power BI, you just hit reload current model, and at that point it'll reconnect and stream all that data back in. That's all it takes. It's nice and quick and easy. You know, so basically that's it's kind of a cool thing. We do have the ability inside this to connect to either the active workbook if you're working in Excel, or if you happen to have 2 or 3 different workbooks open, you can be working in one and connect to another model in another workbook so you can compare them back and forth. Now, we don't actually run 2 models side by side. We're talking about it, but right now it's an either or, but it just takes a little bit of time to refresh it and whatnot. So
yeah. Really interesting.
I won't demo these parts because one of these is grayed out for a reason, but exporting model components, we actually do an export. Well, actually, I'll demo, tell you what, let me go back and open up one of my other files, because I think I do still have one of these guys open here that, no, I don't. So let me go and open one of these guys back up for a sec. I'll go pick up this one short. I'll show you what happens with our import-export features. We do 2 things. We can import from a Monkey Tools backup file. So when you connect to that, we can grab it from here. Those come from this place where we export model components. You can actually export it to a text file. Something else you can do, one of my clients asked me for those. They actually wanted to export the queries to a new worksheet or a new workbook with each query on a different sheet. This gave them the ability to then go and actually use their differencing tools to actually run through it and say, is anything actually different? So that was kind of an interesting feature we got asked for. One thing that I'm working on, I'm not there yet. There is an easy way to go and take your Power BI file and say import the Excel contents, convert all the Power Queries, Power Pivot, all that kind of jazz in the model, but there's no way to go back. Because I do everything in Excel, oftentimes I want to work backwards. This is one of my big goals that I really want to get to here, is I want to import from Power BI back to Excel so I can actually do some work on these things. I won't be able to do that in cases, many-to-many relationships would kill me, but at least if I can do the majority of it, or at least let you know that, hey, yeah, this model is compatible to come backwards or not, that's what we're actually sort of shooting out for that. Now, one more component I want to show you, last one. I don't know if you're a DMV guy.
Love DMV guys. Yeah, I'm getting more into it. I haven't learned a lot about it, but I'm getting there. These are super helpful.
Running DMVs in Excel is a pain in the butt, because you need to know how to actually write all of the code behind the scenes in order to run the DMV, to hook it up and then get it landed into a table properly or whatever else. So wouldn't it be nice if you could just actually hit the Discover or the TM schemas for the Power BI models and then just go and say, yes, I want the measures one, and click create, and it does it for you. And even if you could go back to this one here and say, you know what, I'd like to actually tweak this a bit and say, give me the name and let me get the expression columns. Those are the only 2 I want. and create that, and it actually went and run this up. Now,
oh my gosh,
you need to know the SQL for this, and I'll be honest,
yep.
Particularly adding where clauses and stuff to DMVs isn't always possible from my experience. But at least this gives you the idea to actually go back and pull some of this stuff out as well. And this, by the way, is actually working against the model in Power BI, but it also works against Excel models. So
wonderful,
kind of a neat little feature. So, and at that, I'd say that's probably a quick roundup of virtually all the features that are in Monkey Tools. Across a couple of days, couple hours.
Yeah, this has been amazing. Again, my jaw is on the floor. I'm super impressed by how robust this is. Thrilled that I can learn about this. This is absolutely amazing, and I can't speak highly enough of this tool. This is gonna save me hours of time. I can guarantee you already it's going to save me hours of time. So I'm going to definitely spend some more time, dedicate some more time using this. Ken, one question for you. Are you familiar with the external tools ribbon in Power BI desktop now?
I am familiar with the external tools ribbon. I have looked at it. One of the components that I'm trying to figure out is whether or not it actually makes sense to bring some of these things over, because in the external tools ribbon, the main sort of components that you would be interested in looking at is Query Sleuth. I can't really do anything with the Time Sleuth at this point, so it's Query Sleuth, and the Dax Sleuth would be another one. When you look at something like Model Sleuth, you go, okay, well, I mean, I'm pretty heavily bound to the fact that I'm writing this to an Excel worksheet. So now, having said that, I can't imagine that there's a single person out there that uses Power BI that doesn't have Excel installed. So it's not like I can't, kick off an Excel instance and bump it in there. But we haven't put the time to invest into it yet, only because, I mean, I look at Dax Sleuth, and Dax Sleuth is cool. It's got some cool things, but then I also look at tools like Tabular Editor and whatnot, and I go, is it cool enough that it justifies me going and building this thing in there from the effort point of view? Would people actually use it or not? So I'm still struggling with that. So, I mean, if people are really enthused and want to see it come over, I mean,
it's cool enough. I'll tell you right now. even just a button. I mean, again, my world, 90% of my world is living inside the Excel land. I mean, in Power BI land, anyways. Just a button to kick me into Excel is a starting point. Kick me in there and hit the button that says Query Sleuth or something along those lines to give me at least the report out of there would be very, very helpful from my standpoint.
Interesting. Okay, I'll keep that in mind. Yeah, I'm trying to figure out.
You can put on the way backlog.
Well, I mean, I can tell you. I mean, we manage all of our sort of requests, and what we want to do are all in. We keep them all in Azure DevOps, and I think right now we got about 110 things on our backlog that we want to have. We got a ton, right? I mean,
that's good.
Like I say, I'm really excited. I wish I could spend my time full time developing this. I mean, I got a developer that works on it, but we can't go fast enough for what I would like to do, because I got a whole other business line I got to deal with. But I mean, the cool thing about it is, I mean, we are regularly pushing bug fixes out. We're regularly pushing or trying to regularly push out features. I mean, that whole ability to write the Power BI, this is the first time anybody's seen it. We actually never told anybody about it yet. It just kind of snuck in there over about a couple of weeks ago. It's not even, I should actually mention this, we actually have a full user guide that's available, and you don't have to actually to get into the actual program or anything like that for it, but the full user guide is actually available. You can see it online. It's available at the URL that's up top here, but we have a jump point right inside the help area here to go directly to it. So if you're looking for that, that's where you can actually find out how to use some of these features. And it's hard to keep this up to date. Like, we got to do a lot more stuff, and we're constantly trying to add things. So it may be a little bit behind, but at the same time, it gives you a good idea as to how some of the stuff works. So.
Well, for those of you who are watching out there, please go out and go get the tool. It'll definitely be immensely helpful for you. I think it's going to save you a ton of time. In addition to that, for those of you who are the pro and power users, go buy it, because I want to see more features come out of this thing. And the only way we get more features is if we support Ken and give him the love that he needs for just working so hard on this. I knew this was going to be good. I was underestimating how amazingly good this was, and I can't stop grinning and smiling because I'm so pleased how helpful this is going to be. Thank you very much for your time.
Like, Mike, that makes me grin and smile, right? Because I mean, we worked hard on this, and I mean, this has been a passion project I've been working on for a long time. It's only this year that we actually got to start sharing it out there, and I mean, ultimately, I mean, You know, the reason we charge for it is because I do have a developer I'm trying to pay to build it. You know, we got a long way to go before we make this profitable. But at the same time, I mean, you know, I love this, and I mean, I love, you know, being able to add new things that make my life easier and hopefully share that with other people. So we try to keep the price reasonable. I mean, it's less than $100 a year to stay on it. It's you know, but at the end of the day, I mean, if people are finding use from it, which is my hope, that they'll end up buying. And even if they don't want to pay, I mean, there's a lot of features that still work for free. Granted, you know, your M code is still indented. It may not be pretty, but you know, we don't put the color on it. But hopefully, there's enough there to keep you there anyway. And we do keep adding stuff that, you know, does come into the free level as well. So I mean, it's hopefully going to get better and better over time. And I mean, that's definitely our goal. So yeah, so hopefully people enjoy it and give it a run. I mean, it's a free trial anyway for a couple of weeks. Give it a shot. Nothing to lose.
Well, appreciate it. Thank you very much. And with that, I'll do the final sign off. Ken, thank you very much. Super amazing presentation. You're really good at presenting. Oh, awesome. Michael with words.
Good at presentating too.
You're great at doing presentations. Super fun for me to watch. I got super jazzed about the tool. I hope you guys who are out there learning about this tool as well can find some real value there as well. Go out and hit the links in the video description. And Ken, thank you very much. Have a great Friday.
Thanks for having me, man.
We'll do more fun things in the future, hopefully.
All right. Sounds good, man. Appreciate it.
Take care, guys. Thank you.